I'm Madison Mills. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the second female justice ever named to the U.S. Supreme Court, has died at 87 years old. This puts the Supreme Court in the spotlight just 6 weeks before Election Day and leads to questions over who will get to name her replacement. Joining us to talk about what's expected to come next and, of course, Ruth Bader Ginsburg's legacy is Bloomberg News reporter GregStohr. Greg, thank you so much for joining us today.
Good to be here, Madison.
So before we get into the implications and context here of what might come next, I just want to talk about her legacy for a minute. What are some kind of cornerstones of her career that you can remind us of for a bit?
Well, people will always think of her as a women's rights activist. She was that, and she would have been a historical figure even if she had never joined the Supreme Court. She was the leading litigator in arguing in favor of women's rights and to outlaw gender discrimination before she became a justice. She extended that while she was on the Supreme Court. She was a staunch advocate of abortion rights. She was a cultural icon, became a heroine to millions of people, particularly young women and women who wanted to enter the law. She will certainly go down as one of the most historic justices.
And for some people, this felt like a bit of a shock, even though we are used to hearing news of her being hospitalized and struggling with cancer. Did you see this coming?
Yes and no. I mean, we all got used to the idea that this very small woman was so tough she could overcome anything. She had 5 bouts of cancer. She had been in and out of the hospital, including this year. Just a few weeks ago, there was a picture of her presiding over a wedding at a private home. But she's an 87-year-old woman, and these things happen. So while it was a shock in one respect, in another respect, we should not be surprised.
And just to touch on her legacy a little bit more, can you walk me through some of the kind of historic moments from her career in terms of just her fighting sexism on the court?
Yeah, so I'll point to a couple of them. One, probably her biggest majority opinion was the one that said that the Virginia Military Institute could not be an all-male institution, that women were entitled to enroll at VMI. And that's a ruling that will be cited for decades to come, for sure. But then in many smaller ways, you could see her making a difference just on the bench. As one of the few women, for a while she was the only woman, and as a very strong advocate. And some of the cases I think about are there's a case that involved a 13-year-old girl who had been strip searched at school, and while on the bench in the questioning, you could just see Justice Ginsburg being incredulous that the men, even some of the more liberal men on the court, didn't seem to get what an intrusion this was on this teenage girl. And ultimately the court sided with her, and her presence undoubtedly made a difference.
And this morning, we're hearing from President Trump statements about really accelerating the process of picking her replacement. Can you talk me through what this timeline might look like and whether those comments from the president could speed up this timeline?
Yeah, well, so to get somebody confirmed before the election would be really rushing the process. I think you'd have to go back decades to have a justice who was confirmed that quickly. It's not yet clear to me what the timeline is going to be in the Senate. The big question is, when does Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell have the 50 votes he needs to get somebody confirmed? Without a doubt, Republicans are going to push ahead with this, notwithstanding the fact that 4 years ago, when Barack Obama nominated somebody to fill a vacancy on the court in an election year, Mitch McConnell refused to even consider that nomination. What happens with it, with the election coming up, with some vulnerable senators, that's anybody's guess.
And can you talk me through how this works in terms of the looming November 3rd deadline, but then also we have a wait time until inauguration. So let's say hypothetically Biden wins. Could Trump still push someone through in that interim time period?
Theoretically, absolutely. This is more a political battle than a legal one. One thing to keep in mind is that right now Republicans have 53 senators. One of the vulnerable seats is the Arizona seat, where Democrat Mark Kelly is running in a special election and is leading in the polls there. If he were to win, my understanding is he could be sworn in early. He wouldn't have to wait until next year when the new Congress convenes. He could be sworn in as early as November 30th, and that could change the balance on the court. So that's another deadline that I'm sure Mitch McConnell is keeping an eye on.
And just in terms of the election, with mail-in voting and COVID, there's a lot going on with how people are going to vote on November 3rd, right? So what if we don't get an exact result and it's contested and we have 8 justices on the court? What will happen then?
Yeah, that could be a really complicated, interesting question. From a legal standpoint, it's actually pretty simple. So if we imagine a scenario like the Bush v. Gore case in 2000, where the Florida Supreme Court said recounts that could have helped Democrat Al Gore could go forward. The Supreme Court stopped that on a 5-4 vote. Well, if the Supreme Court had only 8 justices and split 4-4, that Florida Supreme Court decision would have stayed in effect and the recount would have gone forward. The hard part is imagining exactly what kind of case would come before the Supreme Court this year, and then imagining what lower court would be taking it up and how that court would be deciding in terms of how exactly this plays out. So it's certainly possible. It will complicate things. It could help Trump. It certainly could help Trump if he were able to get somebody confirmed beforehand, and then he would have a more robust conservative majority on the court. Beyond that, it's really up in the air.
And I know we touched on this, but how likely would you say it is that Trump could get another person on the Supreme Court confirmed by November 3rd?
By November 3rd might be a little bit harder. There are a couple senators who have already indicated that they are not likely to take up a nomination before the election. And then there are some other senators who are a little less clear. There are senators like Lindsey Graham, for example, who is in a really tough, is a huge Trump ally, but is also in a really tough re-election fight in South Carolina. And 4 years ago, he was very clear that if he were in this situation, that he would say there should not be a vote before the election. So it's very hard to handicap at this point. There are a lot of moving parts. I think it seems extremely likely Trump will nominate somebody. When the vote on that happens and what the result will be, it's too soon to say.
And tell me what we know right now about the short list of replacements.
So Trump has put out a list, a very long list of upwards of 40 potential Supreme Court nominees. There are a few names that are being bandied about because we know the president considered them previously for earlier vacancies. One name that is getting a lot of attention is Judge Amy Coney Barrett of the Seventh Circuit, which is based in Chicago. She is very conservative, has spoken out a lot on religious issues, and one would imagine she would be a likely vote to overturn the Roe v. Wade decision. And of course, she's a woman, which may have some political advantages for the president as he fights to win the votes of, in particular, suburban women who so far have been leaning heavily towards Joe Biden.
And I'm wondering, in terms of the timeline here, what might Democrats do to slow down this process, and conversely, what might Republicans do to speed it up?
There's a lot of Senate procedure, and I'm not an expert on Senate procedure. The battle will be heavily political. It will be Democrats saying, well, first of all, that we shouldn't consider anybody. It will be Democrats demanding time and using Senate procedure to get information about the nominee and to try to fully consider it. And then it will be Mitch McConnell, who is as much an expert on Senate procedure as anybody in the country, who, if he has the votes, I think it's my colleague Steve Dennis likes to say, if he has the votes, they'll vote. And Mitch McConnell's the guy who can make that happen.
I want to dig into some specific cases with you, Greg, specifically looking at, of course, what comes to mind is Roe v. Wade. What's the likelihood of that getting impacted if there is a conservative majority?
If there's another conservative justice replacing Ruth Bader Ginsburg, no question, abortion rights will be more in peril than they were before. So right now, the swing vote is Chief Justice John Roberts. He voted in June to strike down a Louisiana law that would have left that state with only one clinic. But along the way, he strongly suggested he would be open to upholding other restrictions. Now, that case did not directly challenge Roe v. Wade or the Planned Parenthood versus Casey decision. But if we get another conservative justice, John Roberts probably is no longer the swing justice on the issue. That swing justice is probably Brett Kavanaugh. Kavanaugh was in dissent in the case in June. He would have left the Louisiana restrictions intact. That would have very likely scaled back abortion access in Louisiana. He has not said what he would do with Roe v. Wade, but certainly one could expect he would be quite receptive to upholding various types of abortion restrictions and scaling back Roe v. Wade.
And what about something like gay marriage?
Gay marriage may be on a little sounder footing, and I say that in part because we saw that decision in the last term on a very different legal issue, but having to do with gay rights and whether federal job discrimination law covers people who are discriminated against because of sexual orientation or gender identity. And in that case, the court said 6-3 that those individuals are protected. And one of the judges in the majority was Justice Neil Gorsuch, another Trump appointee. I think what you might see in the area of gay marriage and gay rights is more of an expansion of religious rights. So that decision left open the possibility that people could object on religious grounds to, say, employing somebody who is gay or who is transgender. And we see this in other contexts. We saw the Supreme Court case a couple years ago involving the baker who didn't want to make a cake for a same-sex wedding on religious grounds. I think it's very likely that we will have an expansion of religious rights in those contexts and might move us back towards what Justice Ginsburg once called a skim milk right to gay marriage.
So we'll be able to get married, just not get a wedding cake. Good to know. Can you walk me through the impact on Obamacare?
Yeah, so that's a complicated and very interesting one. The court is going to hear arguments a week after the election in a case that would strike down the whole Obamacare law, including the protections for people with pre-existing conditions. The Trump administration is backing that challenge. Up until yesterday, there were 5 justices on the court who I could say to you voted to uphold the law against a very similar legal challenge back in 2012. That was Chief Justice John Roberts and the 4 liberals. Well, now there's only 3 liberals on the court. So we now start thinking a lot more about Justice Brett Kavanaugh. And there's a lot of ways the court can deal with this case. They wouldn't, they could strike down just a part of it, not strike down the entirety of it. There's also the possibility, and here's one of the complexities of this. This is a fight over whether a tax change made by the Republican Congress a couple years ago basically undercut the entire law and renders it unconstitutional. If you imagine a world where Joe Biden wins the presidential election and the Democrats take control of the Senate, they would have the power to undo that tax change and to eliminate the legal objection to the law that's before the Supreme Court. So even if the Supreme Court were to think the law as written right now is unconstitutional and must be struck down, Democrats in that scenario would have the ability to essentially prevent the court from ruling and to keep the law intact.
And Greg, I know you have a lot of coverage to get to, so I don't want to take too much of your time, but just a couple more questions for you. I'm wondering if you can talk through whether this will influence voters on Election Day.
Boy, that's a big question. We have seen time and time again that on the Democratic side, where the court just doesn't resonate with people as an issue. It does on the Republican side. Donald Trump 4 years ago used it very effectively to shore up conservative support when he released that list of prospective justices when we knew that there was a vacancy on the court that he would be able to fill. It remains to be seen how Democrats and liberals react to this. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was an icon. She was, I believe, the best recognized justice. She's the one people on the left certainly related to and admired the most. And you don't have to think too hard to know that a Donald Trump appointee replacing her would make a dramatic difference. The question is whether that will mobilize more Democratic votes, and it just remains to be seen.
And lastly, Greg, I'm wondering just what this has been like for you covering this. You're one of the foremost experts on the Supreme Court. You've been covering Ruth Bader Ginsburg for a long time. What was this news like for you, and what was your reaction then?
Well, honestly, it's still a little stunning. It was certainly stunning to just see those words when I got the email to say that she had died. I haven't seen her in person since before the coronavirus outbreak. So in a sense, it's not like when Justice Scalia died and I felt like, wow, I just saw him and I'm going to go back to the Supreme Court and he won't be there on the bench. It will certainly be a massive change, but because nobody is in the courtroom right now, it may not feel like a change in quite the same way, at least not quite as viscerally.
Greg, thank you so much for joining us and giving us that context. And for those of you watching, please continue to follow Bloomberg Quick Take wherever you get your news on all social platforms for more updates on this news as it develops. And thank you so much again for joining us.